The summer of 1876 blazed across the Texas Panhandle with merciless intensity, turning the endless grasslands into a golden sea that shimmered in the heat like water. 22-year-old Jake Morrison guided his small herd of longhorn cattle through the vast emptiness, following ancient buffalo trails toward the water sources that meant the difference between life and death in this unforgiving landscape. Jake had been trailing cattle for 3 years now, working for various ranchers who needed someone skilled enough to move livestock through territory where Comanche war parties still posed a constant threat. His reputation for handling difficult drives had earned him steady work, but this particular job, moving 50 head of prime breeding stock to a ranch near the Canadian River, had pushed him deeper into hostile territory than he'd ever ventured before. "Easy, Red," Jake murmured to his bay gelding as the horse's ears pricked forward with sudden alertness. Red had saved Jake's life more than once by sensing danger before human eyes could detect it, and the horse's nervous behavior suggested that something significant was approaching across the seemingly empty prairie. The sound reached Jake's ears a moment later, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself, growing steadily louder and more ominous. He'd heard that sound before and knew exactly what it meant: buffalo stampede, probably spooked by wolves or thunder, heading directly toward his position with the unstoppable force of a natural disaster. "Son of a—" Jake's curse was cut short as he spotted the dark mass on the northern horizon. Thousands of buffalo moving at full speed in a blind panic that would trample anything unfortunate enough to be caught in their path. His own cattle had heard the approaching thunder and were beginning to mill nervously, their survival instincts warning them of impending danger. Jake's first thought was for his own safety and that of his livestock. The logical response was to drive his cattle toward higher ground and get out of the stampede's path as quickly as possible. But as he turned Red toward a nearby ridge, movement in a grove of cottonwoods caught his attention, movement that made his blood run cold with understanding of the tragedy about to unfold. A young Comanche girl, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, knelt beside a wounded horse near the creek that ran through the grove. The animal appeared to have stepped in a prairie dog hole and broken its leg, leaving the girl stranded directly in the path of the oncoming stampede. She was trying desperately to help the horse to its feet, apparently unaware that thousands of terrified buffalo were bearing down on her position. Jake faced a split-second decision that would define his character and potentially determine whether he lived to see another sunset. He could save himself and his cattle by riding to safety, leaving the Comanche girl to face the stampede alone. Or he could risk everything: his life, his livelihood, and his future, to save someone his culture had taught him to consider an enemy. The choice was made before conscious thought could interfere with moral instinct. Jake spurred Red toward the grove at a dead run, abandoning his cattle and betting his life that he could reach the girl before the buffalo overwhelmed them both. "Get away from the horse," he shouted as he approached, though he doubted she understood English. The girl looked up with startled dark eyes, her face showing confusion and fear at the sight of a white man charging toward her. The buffalo were close enough now that Jake could feel the vibration of their hooves through Red's body and see the dust cloud that preceded the main herd like a storm front. He had perhaps 30 seconds to reach the girl and get both of them to safety, not nearly enough time for careful planning or gentle persuasion. Jake dismounted while Red was still moving, hitting the ground at a run, and scooping the Comanche girl up in his arms despite her struggles and protests. She was lighter than he'd expected, but fought with the fierce determination of someone who didn't understand that he was trying to save rather than capture her. "Hold on," Jake yelled, boosting her onto Red's back before vaulting up behind her. The horse wheeled toward the ridge with the smooth precision of an animal that understood survival depended on speed and sure footing. They reached higher ground just as the leading edge of the buffalo herd crashed through the cottonwood grove like a brown tide, obliterating everything in their path. The wounded horse disappeared beneath thousands of hooves, and the very earth seemed to shake with the power of the stampede. For nearly 10 minutes, Jake and the Comanche girl sat motionless on the ridge, watching in awed silence as the buffalo passed below them in an endless stream of muscle, horn, and primal terror. The girl had stopped struggling once she realized what Jake had saved her from, but her dark eyes remained watchful and wary. When the last of the buffalo had passed and the dust began to settle, Jake found himself alone on the prairie with a young Comanche woman whose life he had just saved, a situation that could prove either fortunate or fatal, depending on how her people chose to interpret his actions. Chapter 2. The Warrior's Daughter. The silence that followed the Stampede's passage felt almost sacred after the thunderous chaos that had preceded it. Jake and the Comanche girl remained motionless on the ridge, both absorbing the magnitude of what had just occurred while trying to understand what should happen next. The cottonwood grove where she had been trapped now looked like a battlefield, with trees stripped bare and the ground churned into deep furrows by thousands of hooves. The girl spoke for the first time since Jake had grabbed her, her voice clear and surprisingly mature despite her youth. "You saved my life," she said in careful English, her accent marking her as someone who had learned the language through trading or contact with white settlements. "Seemed like the right thing to do," Jake replied, studying her face and trying to gauge whether she viewed him as rescuer or potential threat. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, dark hair shifting to reveal the intricate beadwork on her dress that marked her as someone of importance within her tribe. "My horse, Windrunner, he is gone." Her voice carried genuine grief for the animal that had been her companion and means of survival in the harsh landscape. "I'm sorry about your horse," Jake said honestly. "He was a beautiful animal, but horses can be replaced. Lives can't." The girl's expression showed surprise at his compassionate response. In her experience, white men rarely showed concern for Indian losses or acknowledged the bonds between her people and their animals. "You speak like friend, not enemy." "I don't consider you my enemy," Jake replied. "Right now you're just a person who was in trouble and needed help." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders, multiple horses moving at speed across the prairie. Jake felt his stomach tighten with apprehension as he counted at least 6 mounted figures heading toward their position. In this territory, riders usually meant either cavalry patrols or Comanche war parties, and either option could spell serious trouble for a white man found alone with a young Comanche woman. "My father," the girl said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and concern. "He comes looking for me." Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle before he forced himself to leave the weapon in its scabbard. If these were the girl's people, hostile actions would only ensure his death. His best chance lay in demonstrating peaceful intentions and hoping that saving the girl's life would earn him consideration rather than immediate execution. The approaching riders resolved into a Comanche war party led by a man who commanded obvious respect and authority. He appeared to be in his 40s, with the weathered features and confident bearing of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions for others. His weapons and horse gear marked him as a war chief of considerable status, and the fury in his dark eyes suggested that finding his daughter with a white stranger had triggered protective instincts that could prove lethal. The war chief spoke rapidly in Comanche, his tone clearly questioning and demanding. The girl responded in the same language, gesturing toward the devastated grove and obviously explaining what had occurred. Jake caught enough words to understand she was describing the stampede and his rescue, but the chief's expression remained skeptical and dangerous. "You," the war chief said in accented but clear English, fixing Jake with a stare that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. "You touch my daughter. Why are you not dead?" "Because he saved my life, father," the girl interjected before Jake could respond. "The buffalo came like thunder, and my horse was injured. This man risked his own life to carry me to safety." The chief's eyes shifted between Jake and his daughter, clearly trying to reconcile their story with his expectations about white men's behavior toward Comanche women. "You had chance to escape. Why you help enemy of your people?" Jake chose his words carefully, understanding that his answer could determine whether he lived to see another day. "She wasn't my enemy in that moment. She was just a person in danger who needed help. And I was raised to believe that turning your back on someone in trouble makes you less than human." The chief studied Jake with the intensity of someone trying to read character and motivation in unfamiliar territory. Around them, the other warriors maintained ready positions, their weapons accessible but not yet threatening. Jake could sense that his fate hung in the balance of decisions being made according to cultural codes he didn't fully understand. "I am Running Wolf, war chief of the Southern Comanche," the chief announced formally. "This is my daughter, Morning Star, who will one day be wife to important warrior. You have saved her life when you could have saved only yourself." "Jake Morrison," Jake replied with equal formality, "and I'm glad I was in the right place to help." Running Wolf dismounted and approached Jake with the measured steps of someone making a significant decision. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of ceremony and cultural obligation. Among my people, one who saves life of chief's daughter creates sacred debt. Debt that must be honored according to ancient ways of our ancestors. Morning Star's eyes widened with understanding, and she spoke quickly to her father in Comanche. Whatever she said caused Running Wolf to nod slowly, his expression shifting from suspicion to something approaching respect. My daughter says you risked everything to save her, expecting nothing in return. This makes debt even greater. Running Wolf paused, clearly weighing options that would have far-reaching consequences. Jake Morrison, I offer you protection of Running Wolf and all who follow him. Sacred promise that extends to your family, your property, your life. The magnitude of what was being offered wasn't lost on Jake. In a territory where Comanche raids could destroy entire settlements, protection from a war chief of Running Wolf's stature represented security that no amount of money could purchase. I'm honored by your offer, Jake said carefully, but I don't expect any reward for doing what was right. This not reward, Running Wolf replied firmly. This is honor, debt that must be paid according to laws older than memory. You accept or you insult my family and my ancestors. Jake realized he was being offered something far more significant than simple protection. He was being invited into a relationship of mutual respect and obligation that could bridge the deadly divide between their peoples. Then I accept, with gratitude and respect, Jake said, understanding that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Chapter 3. The Sacred Bond. The ceremony that followed Running Wolf's declaration was unlike anything Jake had ever witnessed. The war chief removed a leather cord from around his neck, upon which hung a carved bone pendant shaped like a wolf's head, a symbol that clearly held deep spiritual significance within Comanche culture. This is mark of my protection, Running Wolf explained as he placed the cord around Jake's neck. Any Comanche warrior who sees this will know you are brother to Running Wolf, under sacred protection of the Wolf clan. Morning Star watched the ceremony with obvious pride and satisfaction, her dark eyes reflecting an understanding of the cultural magnitude of what was occurring. She spoke to her father in rapid Comanche, her tone suggesting she was providing additional details about Jake's character and actions during the rescue. My daughter says you could have taken her captive, brought her to soldiers for reward money, Running Wolf translated. Instead, you carried her to safety and asked for nothing. This shows heart of true warrior, regardless of skin color. Jake fingered the wolf pendant, feeling its weight both physically and symbolically. Chief Running Wolf, I need you to understand something. I'm grateful for your protection, but I won't use it to take advantage of anyone or to avoid the consequences of my own actions. The war chief's expression showed approval at Jake's directness. Good. Sacred protection is for honorable men, not cowards who hide behind others' strength. As the small group prepared to part ways, Running Wolf made an unexpected proposal that would test Jake's understanding of honor and obligation. You come to our camp tonight, share food with my family, meet elders who must know the man I have pledged to protect. The invitation was clearly more command than request, but Jake recognized the honor being offered. Few white men had ever been welcomed into a Comanche camp as guests rather than prisoners, and the opportunity to understand their culture from the inside was unprecedented. I would be honored to accept your hospitality, Jake replied formally. The ride to the Comanche camp provided Jake with his first opportunity to observe their group dynamics and leadership structure. Running Wolf clearly commanded absolute respect from his warriors, but Jake noticed that he also listened carefully to their counsel and treated them as valued advisors rather than subordinates. Morning Star rode beside her father with the confidence of someone accustomed to being treated as an important member of the community, rather than merely property to be protected. Her occasional comments were clearly valued by the warriors, suggesting that Comanche women held more influence than Jake had been led to believe by frontier stereotypes. My daughter has gift for reading character, Running Wolf explained when he noticed Jake's attention to Morning Star's participation in their discussions. She says your spirit is clean, that you have no hatred in your heart for our people. I've learned that hatred usually comes from fear and ignorance, Jake replied thoughtfully. Hard to hate people once you get to know them as individuals. The Comanche camp, when it finally came into view, challenged every assumption Jake had held about savage living conditions. The arrangement of teepees followed clear organizational principles with designated areas for different activities and careful attention to defensive positioning. The camp showed all the signs of a sophisticated community that had mastered the art of mobile civilization. Children playing between the teepees stopped to stare at the unusual sight of a white man riding peacefully with their war chief. Their curiosity was natural and innocent, unmarked by the fear or hostility that Jake had expected to encounter. "They have never seen white man who was not prisoner or enemy," Running Wolf explained. "You are, how do you say, curiosity to them." The formal introduction to the tribal elders took place around a central fire where the most respected members of the community had gathered to evaluate this unprecedented situation. Jake found himself facing a council of weathered men and women whose combined wisdom represented generations of survival in harsh circumstances. Running Wolf spoke at length in Comanche, clearly explaining the circumstances of Jake's rescue of Morning Star and the sacred debt that had been created. The elders listened with the intense attention of people who understood that decisions made here could affect the entire community's relationship with white settlers. When Running Wolf finished his account, the oldest woman in the group, a figure of obvious authority despite her advanced age, spoke directly to Jake in surprisingly good English. "I am Grandmother Willow, keeper of traditions for our people," she said with dignity that commanded immediate respect. "Running Wolf tells us you saved his daughter's life without thought of reward or advantage. Is this true?" "It's true," Jake replied simply. "She was in danger, and I was in a position to help. I couldn't live with myself if I'd ridden away and let something terrible happen. And now, do you expect our gratitude to provide you with advantage over our people? Will you carry tales to soldiers about our camp, our numbers, our movements?" The question struck to the heart of the trust being offered, and Jake understood that his answer would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the safety of everyone in the camp. "Grandmother Willow, I give you my word that nothing I see or hear in your camp will ever be shared with soldiers or anyone else who might use it to harm your people. The protection Chief Running Wolf has offered me comes with obligations on my part as well." The elderly woman studied his face with eyes that had seen decades of broken promises and betrayed trust. Finally, she nodded slowly. "You speak like man of honor. We will see if your actions match your words." The feast that followed provided Jake with insights into Comanche culture that no white person had ever been privileged to witness. The community's social structure, their spiritual beliefs, and their sophisticated understanding of survival in harsh environments gradually revealed themselves through observation and careful questioning. "You are surprised by what you see," Morning Star observed, as they shared a meal of buffalo meat and wild vegetables. "White people think we are savages who live like animals." "I was ignorant," Jake admitted honestly. "I've learned more about civilization in one evening here than in years of listening to stories in settlements." "Perhaps," Running Wolf said thoughtfully, "this is why spirits brought you to save my daughter. Not just to create debt between us, but to build bridge between our peoples." Jake considered the war chief's words, beginning to understand that his simple act of heroism might have consequences far beyond anything he had imagined. The bond forming between him and this Comanche family could potentially influence the relationship between two cultures locked in deadly conflict. But that night, as he rested in the teepee that had been prepared for him, Jake's thoughts focused less on grand possibilities than on the remarkable people who had welcomed him with trust and honor, despite every reason for suspicion and hostility. Chapter 4. Test of Loyalty. 3 weeks had passed since Jake's introduction to Running Wolf's band, and the late summer of 1876 found him in an impossible position that tested every aspect of the sacred bond that had been forged between him and the Comanche war chief. Word had reached the camp that Colonel Marcus Reynolds, commanding officer of the nearest cavalry post, was organizing a major expedition to locate and eliminate Comanche war parties in the region. Jake sat beside the central fire, listening to the heated debate among the tribal council as they discussed their options for avoiding the approaching military force. His position as a protected friend of the tribe gave him access to strategic discussions that no white man had ever been privileged to hear, but it also placed him in the morally complex situation of possessing information that could affect the safety of both communities. "The Blue Soldiers come with many men and guns," reported Swifthorse, a young warrior who served as one of Running Wolf's scouts. "They burn camps, kill women and children, Take prisoners to far places where our people die slowly. Running Wolf's expression remained calm, but Jake could see the weight of leadership pressing heavily on the war chief's shoulders. How many soldiers? What weapons do they carry? More than 100, maybe more. They have wagon guns, the ones that shoot many bullets very fast, and they are led by a yellow-hair colonel who is known for showing no mercy to our people. Jake felt his stomach tighten as he realized they were discussing Colonel Reynolds, an officer whose reputation for brutal tactics had earned him both military commendations and widespread fear among native tribes. Reynolds believed that the only solution to the Indian problem was complete extermination, and he had the political support to implement his philosophy without interference from Washington. "We could move camp," suggested Grey Eagle, one of the elder warriors. "Take our people deeper into sacred lands where soldiers fear to follow, and abandon our hunting grounds. Let them drive us from places where our ancestors are buried." Running Wolf's voice carried the frustration of a leader facing impossible choices. "Each time we retreat, they take more of our homeland." Morning Star, who had been listening quietly to the council discussion, spoke with the insight that had earned her father's respect. "Perhaps we should ask our white brother what he knows of this yellow-hair colonel's plans." All eyes turned to Jake, and he felt the weight of conflicting loyalties settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He possessed information that could help the Comanche avoid disaster, but sharing military intelligence would make him a traitor to his own people and potentially cost lives on both sides of the conflict. "I know Colonel Reynolds," Jake said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone walking through a minefield. "He's not a man who shows mercy to anyone he considers an enemy." "Then you know his ways of fighting?" Running Wolf asked. "His weaknesses? His habits in battle?" The question struck at the heart of Jake's moral dilemma. He could provide tactical information that might save the lives of people who had shown him nothing but trust and honor. But doing so would cross a line that could never be uncrossed, making him an active participant in warfare against his own people. "Chief," Jake said quietly, "I can't give you information that would be used to harm soldiers, just like I wouldn't give soldiers information to harm your people. The protection you've offered me doesn't make me a Comanche warrior. It makes me someone who owes loyalty to both sides." Running Wolf studied Jake's face with the intensity of someone trying to understand a completely foreign concept. "You would let soldiers kill your Comanche brothers rather than help them fight. I would try to find a way to prevent killing on both sides," Jake replied. "Maybe there's another solution, something that protects your people without requiring a battle that will cost lives on both sides." The suggestion sparked intense discussion among the council members, with some warriors arguing that Jake's refusal to share military secrets proved he was still fundamentally loyal to white interests, while others respected his attempt to maintain honor toward both communities. Grandmother Willow, who had remained silent throughout the debate, finally spoke with the authority of someone whose wisdom was unquestioned. "The white brother speaks with straight tongue. He does not want Comanche to die, but he also does not want soldiers to die. This shows clean heart, even if it does not show warrior's spirit. But it does not solve our problem," Grey Eagle pointed out pragmatically. "Reynolds comes with many soldiers. We must either fight or run, and both choices bring death to our people." Jake wrestled with the implications of what he was about to propose, understanding that his words could change the course of events in ways that might prove catastrophic. What if there was a third choice? What if someone could warn Colonel Reynolds that attacking your camp would cost him more than he's prepared to pay? "You would speak to this colonel for us?" Running Wolf asked, his tone suggesting he wasn't sure whether Jake's offer represented wisdom or naive foolishness. "I would try to convince him that peaceful solutions serve everyone's interests better than warfare," Jake replied. "Reynolds is a hard man, but he's also a practical soldier. If he understood that attacking your camp would result in heavy casualties and political complications, he might be willing to consider alternatives." Morning Star leaned forward with obvious interest in Jake's proposal. "And what would you tell him about our strength, our numbers, our plans?" "Nothing that could be used to harm your people," Jake said firmly, "but I could make it clear that any attack would be costly and that there are better ways to resolve conflicts than through violence." The council debate that followed lasted well into the night, with arguments ranging from practical strategy to questions of honor and loyalty that touched the heart of Comanche cultural values. Jake listened with growing understanding of the impossible pressures facing tribal leaders who had to balance survival against dignity, adaptation against tradition. Finally, Running Wolf made the decision that would test the strength of the sacred bond between him and Jake. "You may try to speak with the yellow-hair colonel, but know this: if your words bring soldiers to our camp, if your attempt at peace results in harm to my people, the protection I have offered will not save you from the consequences." Jake nodded, understanding that he was about to undertake a mission that could cost him his life, regardless of its outcome. If he failed to convince Reynolds to avoid attacking the camp, both communities would suffer. If he succeeded through methods that the Comanche considered dishonorable, he could lose the trust and protection that had become central to his identity. "I understand the risks," Jake said quietly, "but sometimes the only way to honor your obligations to everyone is to risk everything for the chance of preventing tragedy." As he prepared to leave the camp on what might be his final mission, Jake reflected on how much his life had changed since that moment when he chose to save Morning Star from the buffalo stampede. A simple act of heroism had created bonds of loyalty and obligation that now required him to risk everything in an attempt to prevent a war that could destroy everyone he had come to care about. The wolf pendant hung heavy around his neck as he rode into the darkness, carrying with him the hopes and fears of people who had trusted him with their lives and their future. Chapter 5. The Price of Honor. Final chapter. The autumn of 1879 found Jake Morrison standing on the porch of the trading post he had established at the boundary between Comanche territory and white settlement lands, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. 3 years had passed since his desperate attempt to prevent a war between Colonel Reynolds and Running Wolf's band, and the intervening time had transformed both his life and the relationship between two peoples who had once seemed destined for eternal conflict. The trading post itself stood as a testament to the power of trust and mutual respect to overcome even the deepest cultural divides. Built with lumber provided by white settlers and decorated with craftswork created by Comanche artisans, the building represented something unprecedented in frontier history, a place where both communities could meet, trade, and resolve disputes without violence or deception. "Jake," called Morning Star from the doorway, her voice carrying the affection of someone who had become far more than the Comanche girl he had once saved from a stampede. Now 21 and his wife of 2 years, she had grown into a woman whose wisdom and diplomatic skills had made her an invaluable bridge between their peoples. "Father is here with news from the reservation." Jake turned to see Running Wolf approaching on horseback, his bearing still proud despite the changes that government policy had forced upon his people. The war chief had aged considerably since their first meeting, the weight of guiding his band through the transition to reservation life having carved new lines of responsibility and sorrow into his weathered features. "My son," Running Wolf said as he dismounted, using the formal term of respect that had replaced their earlier relationship of debt and obligation. "The Indian agent brings word from Washington. They want to know if you will speak to the big chiefs in the white man's capital about what we have built here." The invitation represented recognition of something remarkable that had emerged from Jake's desperate diplomatic mission 3 years earlier. His meeting with Colonel Reynolds had indeed prevented the planned attack on Running Wolf's camp, but not through the military threats or political maneuvering that either side had expected. Instead, Jake had convinced the colonel to visit the Comanche camp personally, under a flag of truce to see for himself the people he had been ordered to destroy. What Reynolds discovered challenged every assumption he held about savage warriors and their supposed threat to civilization. The colonel found a community struggling to maintain its dignity while adapting to impossible circumstances, led by a war chief whose primary concern was protecting his people rather than seeking revenge against white settlers. Most importantly, he encountered families, children, and elders whose humanity could not be denied by anyone with the courage to look beyond military uniforms and cultural prejudices. "Chief Running Wolf," Reynolds had said during that historic meeting, "I came here prepared to treat you as enemies who needed to be eliminated. Instead, I find people who want the same things my own family wants: security, prosperity, and the chance to raise their children in peace." The agreement they reached that day became known as the Morrison Compact, named for the young man whose willingness to risk everything for peace had made the negotiations possible. Rather than forcing the Comanche onto distant reservations, where they would slowly die of disease and despair, the compact established a local reservation where they could maintain their cultural identity while learning to coexist with white settlements. More importantly, it created mechanisms for resolving conflicts through negotiation rather than warfare, with Jake's trading post serving as neutral ground where disputes could be addressed before they escalated into violence. "What exactly do they want me to tell the officials in Washington?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "They want to know how we made peace when everyone said peace was impossible," Morningstar replied, her hand finding his in a gesture that symbolized the personal bond underlying their diplomatic success. "They want to know if what we built here can work in other places." Jake considered the request while watching children from both communities play together in the dusty yard beside the trading post. The sight of Comanche and white children sharing games and laughter had once seemed as impossible as the moon falling from the sky, but it had become so natural that few people even remarked on it anymore. "The truth is," Jake said finally, "what we built here didn't come from any grand plan or political strategy. It came from people choosing to see each other as human beings instead of enemies, and from the willingness to risk everything for the chance of building something better." Running Wolf nodded approvingly. "You will tell them that peace requires courage from both sides. Courage to trust, courage to change, courage to admit when you have been wrong about other people." The journey to Washington 3 months later provided Jake with his first real understanding of how extraordinary their frontier success appeared to Eastern politicians and military leaders. In a capital accustomed to hearing only reports of Indian raids, broken treaties, and military expeditions, the story of the Morrison Compact represented hope for solutions that didn't require the complete destruction of Native American peoples. "Mr. Morrison," said Secretary of the Interior Carl Schurz during their private meeting, "your report describes achievements that seem almost impossible given the hostility that has characterized relations between whites and Indians throughout the West. How do we know this isn't simply a temporary truce that will collapse at the first sign of trouble? Because it's been tested by trouble, Mr. Secretary," Jake replied, thinking of the cattle rustling incident that had nearly reignited warfare between the communities until mediation at the trading post resolved the dispute peacefully. "We've had conflicts, disagreements, and misunderstandings. The difference is that we've built ways to solve problems without killing each other. And what would you recommend for implementation in other regions?" Jake had given considerable thought to that question during his long journey east. "Start with individuals rather than governments. Find people on both sides who are willing to take personal risks for the sake of peace. Give them the authority to make decisions and the resources to build something together. And most importantly, abandon the idea that one culture has to disappear for the other to survive." The legislation that eventually emerged from Jake's testimony, the Morrison Peace Initiative, authorized the establishment of similar trading posts and mediation centers throughout the frontier, with federal support for communities willing to experiment with cooperation rather than conquest. When Jake returned to Texas 6 months later, he found that news of Washington's interest in their model had spread throughout the territory, attracting visitors from as far away as California and Dakota Territory who wanted to see firsthand how former enemies had become partners. "You know," Morningstar observed one evening as they watched Running Wolf teaching their infant son traditional Comanche songs, while Jake's elderly father told frontier stories to a group of mixed children, "Sometimes I think about that day when the buffalo came, and I wonder what would have happened if you had chosen differently." "I think about that too," Jake admitted, pulling his wife closer as their son gurgled happily in his grandfather's arms. "But I've learned that most of the really important choices we make aren't really choices at all. They're just moments when we discover who we really are." As the stars emerged over the peaceful valley where two worlds had learned to coexist, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this place of hope and possibility. A split-second decision to save a young girl from a stampede had grown into something far larger than he could have imagined, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of courage could change entire worlds. The wolf pendant still hung around his neck, no longer a symbol of debt and obligation, but a reminder that honor required the willingness to risk everything for what was right. The sacred bond that had begun with Running Wolf's gratitude had evolved into something deeper and more lasting, a family that transcended racial boundaries and a community that proved peaceful coexistence was not only possible, but profitable for everyone involved. Standing on his porch each evening, watching children who would grow up bilingual and bicultural play in the fading light, Jake understood that his greatest achievement wasn't the trading post or the peace compact or even the recognition from Washington. His greatest achievement was the simple recognition that courage and compassion could overcome any obstacle when people chose to see past their differences to the shared humanity that connected them all. The debt of honor that Running Wolf had offered in gratitude had become the foundation for a legacy that would influence generations of children who learned that former enemies could become family when individuals had the courage to reach across the divides that separated their worlds.